各位观众，大家晚上好，我是今天 TAB Talks 的主持人安妮。在今天的 TAB Talks 开始之前呢，由我来先为大家介绍一下 TAB Talks 这个活动。TAB Talks 清华 Alumni in Boston 是由波士顿清华校友会主办，以传播有价值思想、多元文化人生为体验的主题交流会，营造一个属于大家一起交流的氛围。我们相信每个人背后的观点和故事都值得被传播与聆听。在今天的讲座开始之前，由我来为大家宣读一下权责声明。嘉宾的言论和行为不代表波士顿清华校友会的观点和立场。讲座的音频、视频、文字等资料版权归波士顿清华校友会所有，未经许可，任何人和媒体不得编辑和传播。我们经过今天主讲人的同意，今天的 presentation 会进行录屏，然后我们会upload 到 YouTube 清华校友会官方账号，大家可以随后继续关注。我们的 TAB Talks 在征集主讲人，所以如果你有自荐推荐的主讲人，你可以扫右边的二维码，填写一个 Google Form， 我们会根据大家的所填写的信息来组织接下来的活动。你也可以关注扫左边的二维码，关注波士顿清华校友会的官方账号。小助手会把你拉入 TAB Talks 的群里。这个 TAB Talks 的群，现在是有2个群，第2个群还没有满员，所以如果想加入 TAB Talks 的群，可以扫这个清华校友会小助手的官方账号，要求他把你加到这个群里。我们也会陆续的邀请讲座的嘉宾到群里，如果有其他的问题，大家也可以继续在群里进行讨论。那么我接下来为大家介绍一下今天的嘉宾。今天的嘉宾是 Ellen Pan。他是一个发表了很多英文作品的一个小作者，然后他今天为大家讲的是青少年的英文写作 Learn, Use and Create。现在我们邀请 Illan 来开始他的 presentation。 I will stop sharing.
Hi, everyone. Just to start off, I can give this presentation in English or Chinese, so it's completely up to you whether, it depends on what audience prefers what language, but if we don't have a super strong preference, then I will continue in English. So if you strongly feel like you would prefer me to present in Chinese, then you can let me know. But I will begin in English. Let me share my screen and get started. All right, everybody, welcome to my talk today. I have titled this talk, Learn, Use, and Create, and during this talk, we will be learning about how to discover the creative process, what is the difference between these 3 things, because we often we tend to focus on learning and using in our education, but we tend to focus on creativity a little less. So that's what I want to emphasize today with a thorough explanation of the writing, illustrating, and publishing process, combined with my own experiences as well as my advice for you all if you're interested in something like this. If you have questions at any time during the talk, you can post them in the chat, and I will respond to them as we go. We will also have a period of time at the end for additional Q&A if you have more questions, so also feel free to ask more then. All right, we will have a quick agenda overlook for today. First thing we will talk about is an introduction of myself as well as my background. And then after that, we will talk about learn, use, and create in 3 major parts. The first part will be education. The second part is adaptation or application. And then the third part is creativity or creation. We'll explore the question, what really constitutes creation? And then we'll go down the multiple layers of education and learning, going from language to writing and illustrating, and then finally focusing on a topic that's pretty hot among, I guess, some of the older students in this audience who might be interested in applying to college, And of course, we will also go over publishing and how it has helped me in multiple ways in my life and how it may help you. First of all, I will share my background with all of you. I started in a very small school in Liyang. It was called Liyang 实验小学. So this was a really, really tiny elementary school, and I switched schools 7 times since then. And I also frequently move throughout my education, so I've spent a pretty decent amount of time both in China and in the US. I've had a really good experience with both kinds of education systems, but I do see their differences, which is something that we will also be talking about today. So I started out in this very small Chinese elementary school. In 3rd grade, when I was 8, I came to Virginia in the US to attend Oak Hill Elementary School for 1 year. And after that, I went back to China to attend various other schools until I was 14. So that's when I finished middle school and finally came back to the US to start high school. Essentially, my entire education was done in China, except for 3rd grade and my 4 years of high school. Those were in the US. So actually, Chinese is my first language and English is my second language. I've also had a variety of experiences with language learning, which I will also go in depth about in today's talk. Throughout these years, I learned English, Chinese, and French mostly by myself. English and Chinese are my native languages. French is lacking little, but I'm hoping to get there. But language learning has been a really integral part of my life. And I think that the outcome has been very successful for me. So I would like to share it with you all. First of all, since our title of this talk is Learn, Use, and Create, I like to think of this as a 3-step process. You first learn, then you use, and finally you create. So I think of creation as the final step of our learning process. And throughout this session, we will explore the question of what does it mean to create something? I always like to give the example, let's say you're doing a math problem. If you manage to solve the math problem, then you've learned something. Let's say, how do we find the area of a triangle? You tried on this triangle, you found the area, that means you learned it, and maybe we switch it to a different triangle, maybe a bigger one or a different shaped triangle, then you manage to find its area again, then you would have shown how you managed to use your knowledge. So maybe this triangle and then this triangle, they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty similar. That's a really bad triangle. But this kind of learning is what we consider the first 2 parts of the title, learning and using. But what does it mean to create? You didn't create the triangles, you didn't create the theorem that you use to solve for the triangle's area, and no matter how many triangles you solve, it's not your problem because you didn't invent this. So creation is really something that goes above that, where you create something, you invent something that's purely your own. You are the author or just the creator of this one thing, which I think is really cool. I think to talk about creativity in depth, the first thing that we have to think about is education, how we manage to put creativity into education. And this starts from the basis of the difference between Chinese and American education. I think from my experiences in both of these schooling systems, I've discovered the most notable differences between these 2 systems. I believe that what's more commonly seen in China in their education system is that we tend to favor students who are really good at learning things. So that would be students who are good at memorization, who can take a math problem and solve it, and then learn to solve another one exactly like it. Or somebody who can read a book and then memorize everything in it, and they'll be able to fill in the blanks on the test. These are the students that will excel in exams that are more commonly seen in China. So I think that this is what we call pure learning, where you put information into yourself and then you put out the exact same thing. So again, that favors memorization. And when we talk about learning and using, that develops a little bit differently. since we will be talking more about practicality. So maybe today you fixed a bike, and tomorrow you'll be able to fix a car based on the similar principles that you learned. I believe that these two parts are more integral to the Chinese style of education, which is what I was brought up with in really, I guess, 10 years of my life. I think those two elements I really heavily focused on in my school life. And it was very helpful for me because it helped me develop some very nice logic skills and, I guess, hard skills. That made it very easy for me to pursue higher education afterwards. But I think another very important aspect that people do tend to miss out on when they think about learning and using is that they forget about creation. Most exams that you've ever taken probably don't ask you to create a problem and solve it yourself. They just ask you to solve a problem that's already there. So that's something that is commonly lacking, especially in during all my years of attending school in China. I see that when you score an exam, there's always a right answer or wrong answer, and you have to learn exactly how to use your knowledge to produce the answer that you're supposed to get. And this is really very far from the idea of creation, which I think is very emphasized in the American education system. And again, there's no better or worse one. It's just a different format of learning that I would like to point out. I think that creation is really good for emphasizing authenticity of a student. So in its own, the creation is the act of taking something that you learned and not only using it to apply to something else that already exists, but to make something of your own out of it. You know, you read a book, you look at things that other people have drawn, and then you end up producing your own book, and you get to be the author and illustrator of that book, and nobody else will ever be that. It's your own completely. And I think that this aspect of learning is really cool, and I hope that people will be able to emphasize it more in the future, since it's something that I didn't commonly see when I was attending school. So I think that these are the main differences in education that I've discovered. And it's also a very good way to intersect. If you, for the older audiences, if you do have children, I think it's a very important thing to raise your children with the idea of creativity in mind, rather than raising them with only for the purpose of honing their learning and using skills. I will explain why in just a bit. But to focus on the idea of learning itself, how do we creatively learn? It might sound a bit contradictory, but I will explain how I learned Chinese and English. These two languages are my native languages, how I managed to learn them basically entirely on myself and still ended up having them be my native languages. For Chinese, this is a bit simpler since it's actually my first language. And I grew up mainly in China, so I had all the time in the world to practice it. But how I began learning Chinese was that I started by reading picture books. You can see a list of picture books down here that I really enjoyed reading as a child. Some of them include Mama Lulu Zhen by Richard Scarry. This is a very old book, but it was one of my favorites because of all the really cute illustrations in there. If you look closely, you can see the details, and on every page there's this little worm with a top hat that you have to find. And that was a really, really interesting book for me to read, so I was focusing on the illustrations and using my imagination to picture what could be happening, in those illustrations, in that story, while also reading the very simple text and learning Chinese characters while having fun. Some other ones include 活了100万次的猫 and 吕小弟变石头. Those, I think, were some of my favorite picture books as a child. Again, I think that what I most benefited from was reading a lot of picture books. I read them all the time before bedtime with my parents, and it really didn't matter as much that I understood every single character that I came across, but rather that I read a lot of books and eventually the same characters started showing themselves over and over again. And constant exposure was what really helped me learn those characters better. And what's really interesting is, as soon as you hit maybe around 700 characters, if you know that many characters, you don't even have to know how to write them, you just have to recognize them. Then you have reached basic reading proficiency, and you can start to read a lot more things. So at around that time, you will be able to start reading more advanced books. There will still be blanks that you don't really understand, but you will be able to catch up a lot more quickly as soon as you reach that threshold. And to reach that level of reading proficiency, again, the most important thing is to read a lot, whether that's picture books or some other kind of low content book that's interesting towards children. If you are considering having your children learn Chinese, I'd recommend, highly, highly recommend these books, as well as any other Chinese picture books that you can get your hands on. Now, for more advanced levels of language learning for Chinese, I think that what I benefited the second most from, apart from reading a whole lot, is that I wrote very, very frequently. Of course, I didn't do this when I was a toddler, but when I was 5 or 6, I started first grade and I wrote a lot of blogs on Weibo. So each blog on Weibo is 140 characters, which doesn't seem like a lot, but to a young kid, that's pretty challenging. It was maybe 3 or 4 sentences, and I write 2 of these every day. So after 1 year, I ended up with over 700 blogs. So I've written that many things just in first grade. And I think regardless of how good it was, I haven't looked at them in a really, really long time. It's been more than 10 years. But I think if I look back at them now, I think that it's pretty bad, right? How good can the writing of a 5-year-old be? But I think the most important thing is not to write something that's really stunning or awesome, since that's probably not going to be the goal of a really young child anyways, who's learning a language. But the point is to practice. And the more you practice, the less likely you are to make mistakes, and the more familiar you will be with language and the words that you tend to use, or the characters that you like to use. So I think, in summary, language learning in Chinese, this was what helped me the most, writing frequently and reading. Of course, if you do grow up in a Chinese speaking environment, that's going to be easier. But regardless, I think that those are 2 very good points to take away, regardless of any language you're learning. And here I want to mention something that is related to what I said earlier about being able to write, or rather being able to read with decent proficiency at 700 characters. Language learning can really start at as simple as 100 characters, which is why I want to bring up this book that I wrote over here. Now, this is a book that I created after learning and using characters, but we'll talk about the creation aspect later. I just wanted to point out that this book, The Story of John Yu, also in Chinese, is 小人国的语子中. Something special about this book, at first sight, it might just like any other picture book, but something special about it is that it only uses the first 100 most frequently used characters in the entire Chinese language. And it's really cool that these 100 characters, when you think of the Chinese language, people always think that this language is so hard because there are thousands upon thousands of characters that are all different and there's no pattern to it, unlike other maybe Romance languages. But really, when you take a careful look at this, these 100 most frequently used characters, they constitute over 40% the usage frequency in the entire language. So the books that you read, the newspapers that you read, on average, out of every 1,000 characters that you read, around 400 will be one of these 100 characters. And I think this is really the importance of reading these books, which is also why I wrote The Story of John Yu, because I think it's really important to let young children, when they're still learning the language, to get adequate exposure to the characters that they're going to be using the most frequently. If we abide to the completely learning only method of language learning, you will come across a character and you memorize specifically that character, and maybe you don't see it again for a week or even a month. It's really not that common. And it's surprising because some of what we think as the most simple characters, like Malgo, these are well out of reach of these 100 most frequently used characters. Mal is, I believe, past the 1600th place out of all Chinese characters used. So that's a long way away from our frequent daily use. So I wrote this book in hopes that younger children will be able to read it and get themselves familiarized with the most commonly used characters, and then they'll be able to read really anything because these characters are required no matter what you're writing or reading. So that's something that I wanted to point out that I thought would be really beneficial if you want to learn Chinese, or if you have somebody that you know who would be interested in learning Chinese but don't know where to start. Now, next thing that we'll talk about is learning the English language. This is pretty much the same formula as I mentioned for Chinese, although this is more obvious. The effects are more obvious on myself because English is my second language, and I really never spent, at least to my conscious memory, much time in the US or an English-speaking environment before high school. So in order to develop a decent-sized vocabulary and before you get yourself into an English-speaking environment, I decided that I would also similarly read a lot on my own, even when I had nobody to practice this language with. Here are some of my favorite English books that I read as a child. So these two on the left, those were my favorite when I was maybe 10 or 11. Both these books, Falling Up and The Giving Tree. The Giving Tree might be something that you're really familiar with. It's a classic. These are both by Shel Silverstein, one of my favorite Limerick poets. And as you'll see later in this session, a lot of my writing was actually really, really inspired by him. And on the right over here, we have some books that I read as I got a little bit older. So now I was maybe 12 or 13. So these are longer chapter books with bigger words and are generally more difficult to get used to reading if you're not familiar with English. So I'd recommend you slowly go up the slope and take baby steps. But Wonder, I think, is a really nice book, not only to practice the language, but also philosophically. It's a really wonderful book that I'd recommend to just anybody. And of course, very classic Percy Jackson. I read the entire series, and I think just the sheer length and number of words in that series really helped me develop my English skills. And this example especially, I wanted to point out something that might be that might seem unexpected to people, is that I believe when you first start learning language, if you're a beginner, it's better to focus on quantity over quality. It's very similar to what I mentioned before for Chinese. If you are reading a book where, let's say, maybe 20% of the words you don't know, it would be very, very slow if you search it up in the dictionary every time you come across a word you don't know, because some words, well, a lot of words in the English language, really, and this applies to Chinese as well, you will see it once in this book and it'll never come up again. They're very, very infrequently used. So what really would help you learn a language quickly, rather than searching up every word and becoming a walking dictionary, is that you focus on reading a lot and getting a large enough data set to figure out what are the most frequently used words. And when you see those more and more, they will get stuck in your head, and then eventually you'll learn what they mean, and you'll end up with a vocabulary set of the words that you're going to use the most, instead of using a lot of time on learning words that you're probably never going to use in daily life. So this is what I would recommend for beginners. Of course, these 4 books are not the only ones that I recommend. For people who are looking for more challenging books, I do have a whole book list that I really enjoyed reading the past few years. So if you have a question about that, feel free to ask me later. And another thing about learning language, or rather the English language, this is kind of leaking over to the use and create part of the talk, but after I learned both English and Chinese, I started realizing the differences between these languages that native speakers might not think about. For example, we all know the idiom, the elephant in the room, for example, over here on the left, but if you are not a native speaker, you probably don't know what that means. Just like in Chinese, if you say a idiom, for example, 成语胸有成竹. If you speak Chinese natively, you will know what that means, but if you don't, then you'll be very confused as to what that's supposed to mean, right? This is similar for common idioms in English, and I discovered this phenomenon, so I decided to put my learning to use and use these kind of lighthearted, funny comics and these little drawings to explain to people what each of these idioms mean, where they originated from, and generally the history and common usage of these idioms. These are all available on my WeChat blog, English with Ellen. You may have to scroll back a bit because I did them roughly a year ago, and then after that I got really busy with school, so I temporarily discontinued. But if you would like to look at these, there are about 50 of them that you can all go through one by one if you're interested in learning some English idioms. So this is an example of what you would do if you want to create something with the language that you learned. Over here on the right, you can also see a couple of these dotted across my WeChat blog is more STEM focused English comics. If you like, if you're a fan of chemistry or math or anything STEM related, you might find something that you really enjoy over here as well. All right, so now we'll move on a bit to how to use the stuff that you learned. Okay. Oops. So this is a contest that I highly recommend to anybody who's interested in writing or visual art. It's called the Scholastic Art and Writing Contest, and it's open towards students in grades 8 to 12. So if you're a rising high school student, essentially, or if you're if you're in 8th grade or in high school, you are eligible for attending this contest. And it's just a big online contest where you can submit digital copies of your work. So that could be a Word file of something that you wrote. It could be anything, flash fiction, sci-fi, poetry. They have over 20 categories for both visual art and writing that I've listed over here. And you just have to get on their website and upload something before the yearly deadline. And then after a few weeks, they will release the awards and see if you got anything statewide or nationwide. Nationwide. So I think that this is a really nice contest, at least for me personally. Over here, you can see some artworks that I did that won state awards on the right. I think that this was really nice because it encouraged me to use my skills that I learned. So I've been reading a lot beforehand, but I never really wrote a whole lot that I would consider a complete work. But entering in this contest, it made me feel, I guess, more pressured to actually put something out every year since there is a deadline to the contest. And, if you don't think about the deadline, then you'll never get anything done. At least that's my personal experience. So I think that this art and writing contest was really nice for encouraging, or rather pushing me to build my creative skills and get a few works out every year. It's also really nice when you get the awards back if you did win something, because every time I get an award, whether statewide or nationwide, I feel very, very accomplished, and that really encourages me to do more for the next year. So this is a contest that I would really, really highly recommend to anybody who is interested in writing or drawing. Right, now we are entering part 2, adaptation. So adaptation, we can also call this application of what you learned. The first part was all about learning skills. How do you learn a language? How do you learn to read something? How do you put this word in your head? But putting it in your head and understanding the contents of writing is really not enough for you to write something. You have to put out the words of your own. This is adaptation, writing something after learning from reading something. That's the simplest way that I can put it in a literary way. So here we'll give a poetic example. This is something that I wrote when I was 12, so you can see that the illustrations and the writing, I guess, skill level is not really that high, but this was 6 years ago, so pardon me for that. But this is, well, these are 2 limericks, so 2 little poems that I wrote when I was 12, inspired by Shel Silverstein, which is the author that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the books that I recommended for English learning. Shel Silverstein wrote a lot of these limerick collections where he has really funny little poems with illustrations that he did himself. And I read pretty much his entire poetry collection. I thought that they were really, really inspiring in a humorous way. I think humor is probably one of the things that attracted me to his work the most. And that led me to start writing my own limericks in a similar style to Shel Silverstein. So you can see at this point, it's still very similar to stuff that I've read before, but I'm already learning to use it to create something else that I haven't seen before, right? Starting from the content that I see in my own everyday life. So I'll read one of these limericks for you guys quickly. I prefer the one on the right more. It's called Socks. You say you've lost your socks again, good Lord knows where they went. But I rather suspect, if you'd closely inspect, that the dryer has eaten them in the event. Now, this was a limerick that I wrote because I was really frustrated with my socks disappearing out of the dryer, even though it's supposedly my fault for not keeping them, for not keeping my room tidy enough, but I still like to blame something else for it. So this is kind of a quick poem that I wrote to blame the washing machine, or rather the dryer, for eating my socks and making them disappear in a humorous way. And of course, none of this is meant to be taken seriously, but this one on the left as well, kind of making fun of how parents usually say, oh, we found you in a trash can, or we found a little brother in a trash can. So kind of pulling the everyday little pieces and bits of humor out of my everyday life and turning them into limericks by adapting what Shel Silverstein wrote. These are some shorter examples. And really, what I want to emphasize is that ideas can come from anywhere. What I mentioned earlier, socks disappearing from the dryer, to most people, that might be something that's really annoying. Oh, just buy more socks. But to me, I thought that I could turn it into a funny idea that maybe people can read it and say, oh, haha, I relate to that. So that's something that I think is really cool about writing, that you can connect with your readers through such a simple thing. And this next example as well, A Journey to Perfect Teeth, is another work that I wrote from my personal experiences, this time with braces. When I was 13 or 14, I got braces because my teeth didn't look very good and they hurt so much. I really, really hated my braces. So I was thinking, why do we have to go through this? Why do we have to suffer the braces, even though nobody likes them? And why do we have to keep our teeth clean? Why is dental hygiene so important? And that's after doing some research on that, I decided, what if I could turn this kind of painful experience with my teeth into an educational book for younger children and teach them why it's really necessary for them to take care of their teeth and why you need braces, even though nobody likes them. So this is also a topic that came completely out of nowhere, out of this mundane tooth pain on a Thursday afternoon when I was 13. But I started drafting this book. You can see over here, there are some images of illustrations that I did for this book when I was in 7th grade. So that was in 2017, over, wow, 6 years ago. But I think that these illustrations, this is the finished product on the right, and then these are what I started with on the left. You can see that I developed a lot with my art style and as well generally the content of my book as time went on. So you can see that these very, very mundane topics in your life, they can all turn into a creative source. And it takes a long time to get it right. It takes a long time to produce something that people might consider professional or good looking. But there are many, many sources they can get inspiration from. So these are 2 examples, I guess, of places that I found inspiration even when I was a very young child. Right, so that would be the application of the things that you learn. Now, part 3 is probably the most interesting by far. This is what I consider creation, and it's the part that I like to emphasize the most out of the entire talk. So creation, one very, very major, I guess, component of creation that I do myself is publishing. I have published 6 books now. They're all available on Amazon. And I would like to lead all of you through the publishing process as well. So when we talked about all these things earlier, I talked about how to learn a language, how to write something, how to find the idea for writing. And I showed you the illustrations that I did and how they developed over time. And all of these things are creative and adaptive, that you made these things yourself after learning from material that existed before you. But how do we turn this into, a book that you can hold in your hands? Publishing is definitely the field of creation that I'm most familiar with, so I will teach you guys the technical process of publishing, which will be the first part of this creative portion of this talk. So if you're interested in publishing a book, we showed you earlier here, right? Let's say you have this cover image on the right, you have all the contents of your book that you're ready to show the world, you want some readers. How do you get it to a shelf in a bookstore or on Amazon? So if you would like to publish a book, the first thing that you would have to do is set up an account at kdp.amazon.com. KDP stands for Kindle Direct Publishing, and it's kind of a service under Amazon. Kindle is a part of Amazon that produces a lot of literary material. So you would set up an account there, and it would give you the option to create a book that you can upload and publish. So when you choose to publish a book over here after you made your KDP account, you would have to fill in your book information. So these are some examples of book information down here. First of all, you have to select the language that your book is written in. So it depends if it's written in English or Chinese or some other language, you would select that so it reaches audience that can actually read your book. And after that, that would be the book title. I just gave it a random name here. Probably don't name your book Very Cool Book, but pick whatever title you like. And there's also an optional subtitle if you would want to add a little bit more of a description to your book. And this is a relatively long form. After language and book title, there are lots of other things. You would have to fill in the name of the author and other contributors if there are any. So that could be illustrators or editors or anybody else that has worked on your book with you, or co-authors. And there are some other fields as well, such as the category of your book. Is it a bedtime story? Is it for children, for adults? Is it adventure or mystery or something else? You would choose your categories, then label some keywords for your audience to be able to better find your book when they search for it on Amazon. So let's say somebody wants to search educational book, then you could put education as a keyword so that it comes up when they search any book related to education. And if your book has a main character that's dinosaur, you could put dinosaur as a keyword if kids are looking for dinosaur-related stories. You can have up to 7 of these keywords that will help hone in your audience for the book. And then after that, there will be a variety of other smaller fields that you have to fill out. So that includes the description of your book if people want a quick overview, among a few other things. But that is the book information that you have to fill out as the first part on kdp.amazon.com when you're preparing to publish a book. Next thing would be selecting the format that you want. There are currently 3 formats available on Amazon. There's ebook, paperback, and hardcover, although hardcover is still under development. It's in beta mode right now, so I wouldn't recommend you do an Amazon hardcover. And it really just depends if you want just a digital Kindle copy of your book, or if you want something that you can hold in your hands. Personally, I definitely prefer physical copies, so I've published paperbacks for every book that I've published. But it's totally up to you what format you want. And if you do choose a paperback, so that will be a physical book, you have to choose the size. And some common sizes include, over here, they're very small. I don't know if you can read, but a very common trim size is 8.5 by 8.5 inches. And another common size is 8.5 by 11, or there's also 6 inches by 9 inches. Lots of different sizes that you can choose from. It really just depends what size and what dimensions you want your book to be. And after that, you would pick the bleed settings, which would be choose bleed. I will explain what this is later. And finally, for cosmetic purposes, you would choose the cover finish that you want for your paperback. Matte means it's not shiny, and then glossy means it's shiny, it reflects stuff. And again, that's just personal preference. I think, honestly, both of these look good. That's the first part to publishing a book. And then after you've filled out all your book information and chosen the format and size of your book, you would have to create your cover and interior files. This is a much more complicated process that I won't get very, very deep into, but your interior files are what you see when you open up the book. So that would be the first page with maybe the title and your author's name on it when you flip open the inside the cover. And then it's also the contents of your book, all the illustrations, if you have a forward and afterword, dedications, your copyright, everything that goes inside the book on a soft piece of paper. That's your interior file. And then your cover will be, well, the front and back covers of your book and a spine design as well, if your book is thick enough. So these are the 2 different files that you have to create and upload. After that, Amazon has a really detailed process where they will automatically check for errors. So that's if your book has any content that's too close to the edge that might get cut off when they're trimming your book while printing, they will warn you about that. Or if your book has any spelling errors, or if your images are low quality, they will all warn you. And if everything is well, then they will let your book pass through the system. And if you pick an ebook, then it will show up immediately on Amazon. If you pick a paperback, then it will take a few days to print that and ship it to you. But either way, after all of this is submitted, all you have to do is wait for it to show up on Amazon and tell all your friends and family to buy a copy. So this is a very, very simplified rundown of what publishing a book looks like. Of course, if you have any specific questions, there's a whole lot of detail that I could go into depending on what you're interested in, but for the sake of time, we will keep it relatively short for this section. Now, there are some other details to publishing a book as well. I mentioned earlier that these are the common sizes, and there's something in the previous page I can show you again called bleed. So bleed is basically when they are printing your book. Bleed only applies to paperback books, so you don't have to worry about this if you're publishing an ebook. But if you do want to publish a paperback, you will get, for your cover, you will get a template that looks like this. And you'll see the blue areas on the very edges of the book. These are called the bleed areas. These areas are at risk of being trimmed off when they're finally preparing your book to be printed and assembled together. They want your pages to be even, so they might trim off a bit on the edges. If you have text or important illustrations within these blue areas, the bleed areas, they might get trimmed off. So your content is not allowed to be on the very edge of the book. They have to be concentrated more towards the middle. And for illustrations, there are 2 apps that I do recommend. One of them is Medibang. I illustrated the cover for, or rather all the contents for A Journey to Perfect Teeth with Medibang. So you can see it has a more blocky, cartoonish style, and all the lines are very clear-cut. That's Medibang. And then Procreate is another app that you can use. While Medibang is free, Procreate is $10 and only works on iPads, I believe. It only works for iOS, and Medibang is available on all platforms. So regardless of whether you use a Windows or Mac or any platform, Medibang is available. So that's definitely the more versatile option. But Procreate has more brush options. It's better with color and layers. And if you want to make animations, which is not part of publishing, but just as a side note, Procreate is really good for making 2D animations. These are the 2 apps that I would recommend, and later I can also show you a book that I did illustrate for with Procreate, so you can see the difference between these 2. When you're finished illustrating, that's either digitally or physically, then you would use Canva. I'll also give you a live demonstration of what Canva looks like later, or PowerPoint. Everybody knows what this is. To convert your files, your interior files with all your text content and illustrations, as well as your cover file, so something that looks like this, to PDF files so that you can upload them to the KDP portal where they can assemble and print the book for you. If you are considering making a cover file And if you want a template like this, so you know exactly how big your cover should be and where your text should extend to and where it can't go past the bleed areas, you can go to this website, or you can just search KDP cover calculator. And then there it will ask you to put in the dimensions of your book, so length, width, and how thick your book is. So let's say 24 pages, you will get a skinnier spine. If your book is 100 pages, they will get a very thick spine. So based on the dimensions and page count of your book, they would generate a template that's unique for you, and that's what you will use to guide your cover creation. So these are some additional tips for publishing your own book. There are some other options as well, apart from Amazon KDP, that I would also recommend. The first one is Ingram Spark. While Amazon KDP only allows you to publish your book on Amazon, so that means people will only be able to find this title on Amazon. They can't find it in bookstores or in libraries or anywhere else, just on Amazon exclusively. If you want your book to reach a larger audience, you could choose to go with Ingram Spark instead. This is kind of what the Ingram Spark website looks like when you first get on there. Ingram Spark is a similar self-publishing service. The entire walkthrough process is very, very similar to KDP on Amazon, but a unique thing that it does is that it connects your book to libraries and bookstores. I have published a few books through Ingram Spark, and they've managed to get my book onto the Barnes & Noble website, as well as into the database of some indie bookstores in my area. So if that's something that you're really interested in, beyond the scopes of just Amazon, the one retailer, then I'd recommend you use Ingram Spark. They do have a promotion right now where you can publish one book for free, but usually it would be $49 to publish one book. So it is a bit pricier, while KDP is free. But apart from that option, there's also Lulu, which is, again, a very similar application for helping you publish your own books. But what I like to use it for is yearbooks and photo albums, because Lulu does have an option where you can create very high quality prints. So the paper and print color are both really, really high quality. So it's very nice for making photo books. And over here, these are 3 covers that I randomly made in Canva, by the way. 3 covers that I designed for yearbooks or just, photo books for your family. If you're interested in getting a photo book at the end of the year, I would highly recommend you use Lulu to do it. You would just use the same process that you do to publish a book, format all your pictures and upload it in one file, and it will give you a book that contains only your pictures. And the cool thing about this is that you can format your pictures and add decorations or whatever exactly how you want it to be. And it also is much cheaper than ordering a professionally made photo album at really the same quality, and is most likely faster. So these are 2 options that I really, really recommend if you're interested in exploring publishing more on your own. Right. That is the biggest part of this entire talk, publishing, since it's really the central part to my entire creative, I guess, identity. But at the end, as we go back to talking about education and learning, I want to bring our focus to something that maybe a lot of people have questions about, and that is college applications. Whether you are applying to college, or if you are planning to apply in a couple years, or if you're really young and you don't have to worry about that yet, or if you're already old enough that you have a kid that needs to be worrying about this. I think that this is a topic that inevitably comes up in a lot of conversations, so I would like to address it today, especially since our topic is so closely related to education. And mainly I want to explore what creativity has to do with the college application process and how my results relate to these. So I would say that my application results were fairly good. I was accepted into 14 out of the 23 schools that I applied to in total. Those schools including Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Northwestern, Duke, and then a lot of other liberal arts colleges like Williams and Swarthmore, Amherst. I just everything on the screen. I really love them. All of these schools. I did end up picking Harvard, but I think I would have had zero regrets going to any one of these colleges. So these are my results and what people see on the surface, but I think that what they really like to delve into is what I did behind the scenes to get these results. And that's, I guess, the big thing that I want to share with all of you today, combining the idea of higher education and creativity when so much of what we focus on in education is revolving around learning and using the exact same things that we see in our textbooks. So I want to have you guys imagine the perfect Harvard candidate or the perfect Harvard student. I always like to have people do this as a part of a process when I do a talk like this. So you can type in the chat if you have an idea of maybe a specific quality that you think the perfect candidate for Harvard would be. Let's say you are an admissions officer at Harvard right now, and you have this student. What quality do you see in the student, or what specific thing that they have that would make you instantly, think, oh, this student's perfect for Harvard, or this student deserves to be here? And if you want to participate in that, you can put that in the chat. And a lot of answers that I've gotten in the past is that maybe you have a really high GPA. So 4.0 is as high as you can go, but maybe for weighted, you can go even higher, 4.5, 4.6, 4.8. It just keeps inflating. Maybe you would have a really high SAT or ACT score. And some people say you have a lot of activities, you do a lot of sports or instruments, or you go into your community and help people and just have a lot of leadership. All of these things are very, very common traits in Harvard students and in the people around me that I see at Harvard. It's very true. But I think when we dig to the basis of it, what really helped is not these activities on the surface. And I think in itself, the college application is kind of an example of what you have to do to create rather than just learn and use, right? You can look at everything that I've done. I've told you today pretty much everything that I've done to get into these colleges. You could replicate everything that I do exactly the same, and maybe that wouldn't work for you. Or maybe you could do something totally different than what I did and have really good results. And if I did the same thing, it might not work for me. So I think the problem with a lot of people when they worry about college is that they tend to focus on the learn and use parts of education so much that they feel like if they see one successful example, they want to replicate that and hope that it would give them the same results. But when we emphasize creativity, I think what that really means is that you have to be creative in finding out what you're really suitable for. Think about what you really enjoy doing and creating. When you see something, when you see a math problem, do you want to recreate something similar to that? Or if you don't like math, if you prefer writing instead, when you read a piece, do you want to create something else out of the thing that you read? I think focusing on your own individual interests and creating something out of that is the most valuable thing that you can do to prepare for college, because it shows people the kind of person that you really are. And it's far beyond these, I guess, more structural things like what exact SAT score did you get or what exact activities that you did, because creativity is different for everybody because they all had different experiences and different interests. So it's never going to work the same for every person, and the results are never going to be the same either. I think for me, what really helped is that I published these 6 books when I applied to college. And just as a reference to what I was saying before about Procreate, I illustrated this book, Dear Dad, with Procreate in a watercolor style, which is something that A Journey to Perfect Teeth, so what Medibank doesn't have. So if you prefer more artsy kinds of illustrations, that I would recommend you go with Procreate instead. But I think that this is what really helped me, because my entire passion is in writing, and maybe my creativity in writing is not going to translate into the creativity for the same subject for you. Maybe you have creativity somewhere else. But the fact that I chose to do this, even though there are other, I guess, what seems like more conventional things that I could have done, like research or public service, which are by no means not good. I think they're excellent things to do. But the fact that I chose to create something of my own, depending on my own interests, I think that's what really helped, and eventually what got me into the schools that really fit me as a person. So at the end, I can confidently say, my results were good, but even if they weren't what I had hoped, if I hadn't gone into Harvard, I know that I would have been accepted by a school that saw what I really enjoyed creating, what I really enjoyed doing, and they'd accept me for myself. So I think ultimately, at the end of it, when you learn and you use and you finally end up creating something that you really, really love and are passionate about, I think that is the ultimate goal of learning. Right, and here is my Amazon author page that you can also find. Just by searching Ellen Pan, probably on the Amazon page, you'll find it eventually. And this is an example of what it would look like if you had an author page on Amazon. I've published plenty of books by now, so the page is pretty filled, but you can get a general idea of what you'd see if you had an author page of your own. Over here, I also have a quick bio about myself so people can know what kinds of stuff that I write, and they can also follow me if they really like what I make. So again, I think that personally for me, this entire talk is really heavily revolved around the things that I love to do and the creativity that I engage myself in. So if you think that your passions or experiences are similar to mine and you want to learn more about writing, illustrating, and publishing, I do have a workshop that I call it the print workshop. It's 8 sessions in total. We already ran our first session earlier this summer with over 20 students. It was really, really successful. I'm really happy to see that a lot of my students have already been able to publish their book by the end of the month. So this is a month-long, or rather, this is an 8-session workshop. I was really happy to see that a lot of my students had gone from, absolutely nothing at the beginning of the workshop to a full published book with multiple really good reviews on Amazon by the end of it. So if this is something that you're interested in, we are running a second session starting August 13th. So this will run till close to the end of August. It will be a bit more packed than the previous session where we had classes every weekend. But if you're interested in publishing and writing, I will be guiding you throughout the entire process of this. So you can come completely empty-handed and leave with a book that's written and illustrated by you. So if this is something that you're interested in, more information is up on my WeChat blog, English with Ellen. So that's just a little note at the end if you really are interested in everything that I talked about today. All right, thank you. That is everything that I have for my talk today. If you have any questions, then you can feel free to ask them in the chat or by, unmuting your mic, and I'd be happy to answer them, answer any questions in either Chinese or English. All right, thank you. That is my entire talk. I will put in actually, I can go back to the page over. There is if you want to ask me about more detailed things later, actually, did I skip it? Oh, I didn't. It's called English with Ellen with spaces in between. If you do want to ask me things later, so after the talk, there is a leave a comment option on the WeChat blog. So if you follow my blog, and then you'll be able to, leave a message on there, and I check those periodically, so I'll get back to you at my earliest convenience. But there are a lot of different things on that blog. Last year I did a lot of stuff like comics and written articles. More recently, I've been devoting the blog more to promoting talks that I do and what books I recently published and what classes I'm opening up. So if you're more interested in seeing the creative content, I've been hoping to get those started again as soon as I get more time. But if you want to look at these comics, then you can scroll a bit further down. My major is not decided at the moment. Harvard allows you to have 2 years to decide what you want to learn. So really you solidify your major at the end of your second year, but I am thinking perhaps linguistics right now, since I do speak 2 languages, and I think those both being my native languages has allowed me to see a lot of really interesting nuances between Chinese and English, and linguistics is something that I really want to explore, especially since I am so passionate about writing on its own. How to access WeChat blog? You can, so there at the search bar at the top of WeChat, I think if you go in there and search, I think it's public accounts, 公众号, then you can type in WeChat English with Ellen, and it should show up. Great. Do we have any other questions? Okay. So I think I have a QR code that I can share. I will just frequently just momentarily get to it. Okay, oh yeah, I do have it here. Sorry, give me just 1 second. And I'll put it on the thank you page over here so people can see it more clearly. But I think that I'm pretty sure that this one should still work. Okay, that is the QR code if you're more comfortable scanning that instead of searching. I know that searching can sometimes be troublesome. Okay. Great. That is everything that I have for today. Thank you so much, Tinghua, for allowing me to inviting me to do this talk today. I had a really great time, and I hope that everybody was able to learn something from it. I hope I was helpful. If you have any questions, you can also let me know later by leaving a message on my blog, and I'll get back to you. If you have any questions, I mean, you can still ask now, but that is all I have.